the gracious behavior of His Royal Highness the Duc de Berry to the bridegroom killed all criticism in the very highest circles of the emigration. In less exalted circles there were slight shrugs and meaning glances, but very little else besides, except now and then a veiled sarcasm which could be ascribed to envy as much as to any other sentiment. Amongst the daughters of the emigration there must have been more than one who in her heart of hearts thought Adèle d'Armand a very lucky girl. The splendor of the entertainments which were given to the London society by the newly wedded couple after their return from the honeymoon put it beyond all doubt that the man whom Maglé described as wearing a too-much laced coat was very rich. It began also to be whispered that he was a man of fantastic humors and of eccentric whims of the sort that do not pass current in the best society, especially in the case of a man whose rank was dubious and whose wealth was but recently acquired. But the embittered and irreconcilable remnant of the exiled aristocracy gave but little of its sympathy to Adèle d'Armand. She ought to have waited till the king was restored, and either married suitably, or else entered a convent for ladies of rank, for these too would soon be restored. The Marquis, before the engagement of his daughter had become public, had written to his friend Sir Charles of the impending marriage, in carefully selected terms which demanded nothing but a few words of formal congratulation. Of his son-in-law he mentioned little more than the name. It was, he said, that of a long-impoverished Piedmontese family with good French connections, formed in the days before it had fallen into comparative obscurity, but the Marquis insisted fully recognized by the parties concerned. It was the family de Monteveso. The world had heard nothing of it for more than a century, the Marquis admitted parenthetically. His daughter's intended husband's name was Elion, Count Elion de Monteveso. The title had been given to him by the King of Sardinia, just before that unfortunate monarch was driven out of his dominions by the armies of Republican France. It was the reward of services rendered at a critical time and none the less meritorious, because, the Marquis admitted, they were of a financial nature. Count Elion, who went away very young from his native country and wandered in many lands, had amassed a large personal fortune, the Marquis went on to say, which luckily was invested in a manner that made it safe from political revolutions and social disasters overwhelming both France and Italy. That fortune, as a matter of fact, had not been made in Europe, but somewhere beyond the seas. The Marquis's letter reached Latham Hall in the evening of an autumn day. The very young Miss Latham, seated before an embroidery frame, watched across the drawing-room her father reading the letter under the glare of the reflector lamp, and at the feet, as it were, of the Latham in the yellow satin coat. Sir Charles raised his eyebrows, which with passing years had become bushy, and spoiled a little the expression of his handsome face. Miss Latham was made very anxious by his play of physiognomy. She had already been told, after the first rustle of unfolded paper, that her big friend Adèle d'Armand, Miss Latham was 4 years younger, was going to be married, and had become suddenly but inwardly excited. Every moment she expected her father to tell her something more. She was dying from impatience, but there was nothing further except the rustle of paper, and now this movement of the eyebrows. Then Sir Charles lowered his hands slowly. She could contain herself no longer. "Who is it, Papa?" she asked with animation. Henrietta Latham was 15 then. Her dark eyes had remained as large as ever. The purity of her complexion, which was not of the milk-white kind, was admirable, and the rich shade of the brown curls clustering on each side of her faintly glowing cheeks made a rich and harmonious combination. Sir Charles gazed at his daughter's loveliness with an air of shocked abstraction. But he, too, could not contain himself. He departed from his stateliness so far as to growl out scathingly, "An upstart of some kind." Miss Latham was, for all her lively manner, not given to outward manifestations of emotions. This intelligence was too shocking for a gasp or an exclamation. She only flushed slowly to the roots of her pretty hair. An upstart simply meant to her everything that was bad in the way of a human being, but the scathing tone of Sir Charles's outburst also augmented her profound emotion, for it seemed to extend to Adèle d'Armand herself. It shocked her tender loyalty towards the French girl, which had not been diminished by a separation of more than 3 years. She said quietly, "Adèle? Impossible." The flush ebbed out of her healthy cheeks and left them pale, with the eyes darker than Sir Charles had ever seen them before. Those evidences of his daughter's emotion recalled Sir Charles to himself. After looking at his daughter fixedly for a moment, he murmured the word "impossible" without any particular accent, and again raised the letter to his eyes. He did not find in it anything to modify his first impression of the man whom Adèle d'Armand was about to marry. Once more in his vaguely explanatory message, the Marquis alluded to the wealth of his prospective son-in-law. It gave him a standing in the best society which his personal merits could not perhaps have secured for him so completely. Then the Marquis talked about his wife's health. The Marquis required many comforts, constant care, and cheerful surroundings. He had been enabled to leave the disagreeable lodgings in a squalid street for a little house in Chiswick, very near London. He complained to his old friend that the uncompromising royalists reproached him bitterly for having signed a 3 years' lease. It seemed to them an abominable apostasy from the faith in a triumphal return of the old order of things in a month or 2. "I have caused quite a scandal by acting in this sensible manner," he wrote. "I am very much abused, but I have no doubt that even those who judge me most severely will be glad enough to come to Adèle's wedding." Then, as if unable to resist the need to open his heart, he began the next line with the words, "I need not tell you that all this is my daughter's own doing. The demand for her hand was made to us regularly through Lord G., who is a good friend of mine, though he belongs to the faction of Mr. Fox, in which the Count of Monteveso numbers most of his English friends. But directly we had imparted the proposal to Adèle, she took a step you may think incredible, and which from a certain point of view might even be called undutiful, if such a word could ever be applied to the sweet and devoted child our Adèle has always been to us. At her personal request, made without consulting either her mother or myself, Lord G. had the weakness to arrange a meeting between her and the Count at his own house. What those two could have said to each other, I really cannot imagine. When we heard of it, the matter was so far settled that there was nothing left for us but to accept the inevitable." Again Sir Charles let his big white aristocratic hands descend on his knees. His daughter's dark head drooped over the frame, and he had a vision of another head, very different and very fair, by its side. It had been a part of his retired life, and had had a large share of his affection. How large it was he discovered only now, at this moment, when he felt that it was in a sense lost to him forever. "Inevitable," he muttered to himself with a half-scornful, half-pained intonation. Sir Charles could understand the sufferings, the difficulties, the humiliations of poverty. But the Marquis might have known that, far or near, he could have counted on the assistance of his friend. For some years past he had never hesitated to dip into his purse, but that was for those mysterious journeys and those secret and important missions his princes had never hesitated to entrust him with, without ever troubling their heads about the means. Such was the nature of princes, Sir Charles reflected with complete bitterness. And now came this. A whole young life thrown away, perhaps, in its innocence, in its ignorance. How old could Adele be now? 18 or 19? Not so very much younger than her mother was when he used to see so much of her in Paris and Versailles, when she had managed to put such an impress on his heart that later he did not care whom he married or where he lived. Inevitable. Sir Charles could not be angry with the Marquise, now a mere languid shadow of that invincible charm that his heart had not been able to resist. She and her husband must have given up all their hopes, all their loyal royalist hopes, before they could bow like this to the inevitable. It had not been difficult for him to learn to love that fascinating French child as though she had been another daughter of his own. For a moment he experienced an anguish so acute that it made him move slightly in his chair. Half aloud he muttered the thought that came into his mind. Austerlitz has done it. Miss Latham raised her lustrous dark eyes with an inquiring expression and murmured, "Papa?" Sir Charles got up and seized his stick. "Nothing, my dear, nothing." He wanted to be alone, but on going out of the room he stopped by the embroidery frame, and bending down, kissed the forehead of his daughter, his English daughter. No issue of a great battle could affect her future. As to the other girl, she was lost to him, and it couldn't be helped. A battle had destroyed the fairness of her life. This was the disadvantage of having been born French, or indeed belonging to any other nation of the continent. There were forces there that pushed people to rash or unseemly actions, actions that seemed dictated by despair, and therefore wore an immoral aspect. Sir Charles understood Adele d'Armand even better than he understood his own daughter, or at least he understood her with greater sympathy. She had a generous nature. She was too young, too inexperienced to know what she was doing when she took in hand the disposal of her own person in favor of that apparently Piedmontese upstart with his obscure name and his mysteriously acquired fortune. I only hope the fortune is there, thought Sir Charles with grim skepticism. But as to that there could be no doubt, judging from the further letters he received from his old friend. After a short but brilliant period of London life, the upstart had carried Adele off to France. He had bought an estate in Piedmont, which was his native country, and another with a splendid house near Paris. Sir Charles was not surprised to hear a little later that the Marquise and the Marquis had returned to France. The time of persecution was over. Most of the great royalist families were returning, unreconciled in sentiment if wavering in their purposes. That his old friend should ever be dazzled by imperial grandeurs, Sir Charles could not believe. Though he had abandoned his daughter to an upstart, he was too good a royalist to abandon his principles, for which certainly he would have died if that had been of any use. But he had returned to France. Most of his exiled friends had returned too, and Sir Charles understood very well that the Marquis and his wife wanted to be somewhere near their daughter. This departure closed a long chapter in his life, and afterwards Sir Charles hardly ever mentioned his French friends. The only positive thing which Henrietta knew was that Adele d'Armand had married an upstart and had returned to France. She had communicated that knowledge to her brother, who had stared with evident surprise, but had made no comment. Living away from home, at school, and afterwards in Cambridge, his father's French friends had remained for him as shadowy figures on the shifting background of a very poignant, very real and intense drama of contemporary history, dominated by one enormously vital and, in its greatness, immensely mysterious individuality, the only man of his time. Cosmo Latham, at the threshold of life, had adopted neither of the contrasted views of Napoleon Emperor entertained by his contemporaries. For him, as for his father before him, the world offered a scene of conflicting emotions in which facts appraised by reason preserved a mysterious complexity and a dual character. One evening, during an artless discussion with young men of his own age, it had occurred to him to say that Bonaparte seemed to be the only man amongst a lot of old scarecrows. "Look how he knocks them over," he had explained. A moment of silence followed. Then a voice objected, "Then perhaps he is not so great as some of you try to make him out." "I didn't mean that exactly," said Cosmo in a sobered tone. "Nobody can admire that man more than I do. Perhaps the world may be none the worse for a scarecrow here and there left on the borders of what is right or just. I only wished to express my sense of the moving force in his genius." "What does he stand for?" asked the same voice. Cosmo shook his head. "Many things, and some of them too obvious to mention. But I can't help thinking that there are some which we cannot see yet." "And some of them are dead already," retorted his interlocutor. "They died in his very hands. But there is one thing for which he stands, and that will never die. You seem to have forgotten it. It is the spirit of hostility to this nation, to what we in this room, with our different views and opinions, stand for in the last instance." "Oh, that," said Cosmo confidently. "What we stand for isn't an old scarecrow. Great as he is, he will never knock that over. His arm is not long enough, however far his thoughts may go. He has got to work with common men." "I don't know what you mean. What else are we? I believe you admire him." "I do," confessed Cosmo sturdily. This did not prevent him from joining the army in Spain before the year was out, and that without asking for Sir Charles's approval. Sir Charles condemned severely the policy of using the forces of the Crown in the peninsula. He did not like the ministry of the day, and he had a strong prejudice against all the Wellesleys, to whose aggrandizement this whole policy seemed affected. But when at the end of a year and a half after the final victory of Toulouse his son appeared in Yorkshire, the two made up for the past coolness by shaking hands warmly for nearly a whole minute. Cosmo really had done very little campaigning, and soon declared to his father the wish to leave the army. There would be no more fighting for years and years, he argued, and though he did not dislike fighting in a good cause, he had no taste for mere soldiering. He wanted to see something of the world, which had been closed to us for so long. Sir Charles, aging and dignified, leaned on his stick on the long terrace. "All the world was never closed to us," he said. "I wasn't thinking of the East, sir," explained Cosmo. "I heard some people talk about its mystery, but I think Europe is mysterious enough just now, and even more interesting." Sir Charles nodded his bare gray head in the chill evening breeze. "France, Germany," he murmured. Cosmo thought that he would prefer to see something of Italy first. He would go north afterwards. "Through Vienna, I suppose," suggested Sir Charles, with an impassive face. "I don't think so, sir," said Cosmo frankly. "I don't care much for the work which is going on there, and perhaps still less for the men who are putting their hands to it. This time Sir Charles's slow nod expressed complete agreement. He, too, had no liking for the work that was about to begin there. But no objection could be raised against Italy. He had known Italy well 30 or more years ago, but it must have been changed out of his knowledge. He remained silent, gazing at the wide landscape of blue wooded rises and dark hollows under the gorgeous colors of the sunset. They began to die out. "You may travel far before you see anything like this," he observed to his son, "and don't be in a hurry to leave us. You have only just come home. Remember, I am well over 60. Cosmo was quite ready to surrender himself to the peace of his Yorkshire home, so different from the strenuous atmosphere of the last campaign in the south of France. Autumn was well advanced before he fixed the day for his departure. On his last day at home, Sir Charles addressed him with perfect calmness. "When you pass into Italy, you must not fail to see my old friend the Marquis d'Armand. The French king has appointed him as ambassador in Turin. It's a sign of high favor, I believe. He will be either in Turin or Genoa." Sir Charles paused, then, after a perfectly audible sigh, added with an effort, "The Marquise is dead. I knew her in her youth. She was a marvelous woman." Sir Charles checked himself, and then, with another effort, "But the daughter of my old friend is, I believe, with her father now. A married daughter, the Countess of Monteveso." "You mean little Adele, sir?" said Cosmo with interest. But on Sir Charles's face there passed a distinct shade of distress. "Oh, you remember the child," he said, and his tone was tender, but it changed to contempt as he went on. "I don't know whether the fellow, I mean the man she married, is staying with them, or whether they are living with him, or whether... I know nothing." The word upstart, heard many years ago from his sister Henrietta, crossed Cosmo's mind. He thought to himself, "There is something wrong there," and to his father he said, "I will be able to tell you all about it." "I don't want to know," Sir Charles replied, with a surprising solemnity of tone and manner, which hid some deeper feeling. "But give the Marquis my love, and tell him that when he gets tired of all his grandeurs, he may remember that there is a large place for him in this house, as long as I live." Late that evening, Cosmo, saying good-bye to his sister, took her in his arms, kissed her forehead, and holding her out at arm's length, said, "You have grown into a charming girl, Henrietta." "I am glad you think so," she said. "Alas, I am too dark. I can never be as charming as Adele must have been at my age." "You seem to have forgotten her." "Oh, no," protested Cosmo carelessly. "A marvel of fairness, wasn't she? I remember you telling me years ago that she married an upstart." "That was father's expression. You know what that means, Cosmo." "I do know what it means, exactly," he said, laughing. "But from what father said this afternoon, it seems as if he were a rather nasty upstart. What made Adele do it?" "I am awed," confessed Henrietta. "I don't know what made her do it. I was never told. Father never talked much about the d'Armands afterwards. I was with him in the yellow drawing-room the evening he got the letter from the Marquis. After he read it, he said something very extraordinary. You know, it's full 9 years ago, and I was yet a child. Yet I could not have dreamed it. I heard it distinctly. He dropped his hands and said, 'Austerlitz has done it.' What could he have meant?" "It would be hard to guess the connection," said Cosmo, smiling at his sister's puzzled face. "Father must have been thinking of something else." "Father was thinking of nothing else for days," affirmed Henrietta positively. "You must have been a very observant child," remarked her brother. "But I believe you were always a clever girl, Henrietta. Well, I am going to see Adele." "Oh, yes. You start in the morning to travel ever so far and for ever so long," said Miss Latham enviously. "Oh, Cosmo, you are going to write me. Lots." He looked at her appreciatively and gave her another brotherly hug. "Certainly I will write. Whole reams," he said. Chapter 4. On his way from the harbor to the upper part of the town where his inn was situated, Cosmo Latham met very few people. He had to pass through a sort of covered way. Its arch yawned in front of him, very black, with only a feeble glimmer of a light in its depths. It did not occur to him that it was a place where one could very well be knocked on the head by evil-intentioned men, if there were any prowling about in that early part of the evening, for it was early yet, though the last gleams of sunset had gone out completely off the earth and out of the sky. On issuing from the dark passage, a maze of narrow streets presented itself to his choice, but he knew that as long as he kept walking uphill, he could not fail to reach the middle of the town. Projecting at long intervals from the continuous mass of thick walls, wrought-iron arms held lanterns containing dim gleams of light. The enormous doors of the lofty gateways he passed were closed, and the only sound he could hear was that of his own deliberate footsteps. At a wider spot where several of those lanes met, he stopped, and looking about him asked himself whether all those enormous and palatial houses were empty, or whether it was the thickness of walls that killed all the signs of life within. For as to the population being already asleep, he could not believe it for a moment. All at once he caught sight of a muffled female form. Into the heavy shadow she seemed to emerge out of one wall, and gliding on seemed to disappear into another. It was undoubtedly a woman. Cosmo was startled by this noiseless apparition, and had a momentary feeling of being lost in an enchanted city. Presently the enchanted silence was broken by the increasing sound of an iron-shod stick tapping the flagstones, till there walked out of one of the dark and tortuous lanes a man who, by his rolling gait, general outline, and the characteristic shape of the hat, Cosmo could not doubt was a seaman belonging to the English man-of-war in the harbor. The tapping of his stick ceased suddenly, and Cosmo hailed him in English, asking for the way. The sturdy figure in the tarpaulin hat put its cudgel under its arm, and answered him in a deep, pleasant voice. Yes, he knew the inn. He was just coming from there. If his honor followed the street before him, he would come to a large open space, and his honor's inn would be across the square. In the deep shadows, Cosmo could make out of the seaman's face nothing but the bushy whiskers and the gleam of the eyes. He was pleased at meeting the very day he had reached the Mediterranean shore. He had come down to Genoa from Turin, such a fine specimen of a man-of-war's man. He thanked him for the direction, and the sailor, touching his hat, went off at his slightly rolling gait. Cosmo observed that he took a turning very near the spot where the muffled woman had a moment before vanished from his sight. It was a very dark and a very narrow passage between two towering buildings. Cosmo, continuing on his way, arrived at a broad thoroughfare, badly lighted, but full of people. He knew where he was then. In a very few moments he found himself at the door of his inn in a great square, which, in comparison with the rest of the town, might have been said to blaze with lights. Under an iron lantern swung above a flight of 3 broad steps, Cosmo recognized his servant gazing into the square with a worried expression which changed at once into one of relief on perceiving his master. He touched his cap and followed Cosmo into a large hall, with several doors opening into it, and furnished with many wooden chairs and tables. At one of them, bearing 4 candlesticks, several British naval officers sat talking and laughing in subdued tones. A compactly built, clean-shaven person with slightly sunken cheeks, wearing black breeches and a maroon waistcoat with sleeves, but displaying a very elaborate frill to his white shirt, stood in the middle of the floor, glancing about with vigilance, and bowed hurriedly to his latest client. Cosmo returned the greeting of Signor Cantellucci, who, snatching up the nearest candlestick, began to ascend a broad stone staircase with an air of performing a solemn duty. Cosmo followed him, and Cosmo's servant followed his master. They went up and up. At every flight, broad archways gave a view of dark perspective in which nothing but a few drops of dim fire were forlornly visible. At last Signor Cantellucci threw open a door on a landing, and bowing again, "Si, milord, there is a fire. I know the customs and habits of the English." Cosmo stepped into a large and lofty room, where, in the play of bright flames under a heavy and tall mantelpiece, the shadows seemed very much disturbed by his entrance. Cosmo approached the blaze with satisfaction. "I had enough trouble to get them to light it," remarked the valet in a resentful tone. "If it hadn't been for a jack tar with big whiskers I found down in the hall, it wouldn't be done yet. He came up from the ship with one of these sea officers downstairs. He drove the fellows with the wood in fine style up here for me. He knows the people here. He cursed them each separately by their Christian names, and then had a glass of wine in the kitchen with me." Meantime, Signor Cantellucci, wearing the aspect of a deaf man, had lighted on 2 separate tables 2 clusters of candles which drove the restless gloom of the large apartment halfway up to the ceiling, and retired with noiseless footsteps. He stopped in the doorway to cast a keen glance at the master and the man standing by the fire. Those 2 turned their heads only at the sound of the closing door. "I couldn't think what became of you, sir. I was getting quite worried about you. You disappeared without saying anything to me." "I went for a walk down to the sea," said Cosmo, while the man moved off to where several cowhide trunks were ranged against the wall. "I like to take a look round on arriving at a new place." "Yes, sir. But when it got dark, I wondered." "I tarried on a tower to watch the sunset," murmured Cosmo. "I have been doing some unpacking," said the servant, "but not knowing how long you mean to stay." "It may be a long stay." "Then I will go on, sir. That is, if you are going to keep this room." "Yes, this room will do, Spire. It's big enough." Spire took up one of the 2 candelabras and retired into the neighborhood of a sort of state bed, heavily draped at the other end of the room. There, throwing open the trunks and the doors of closets, he busied himself systematically, without noise, till he heard the quiet voice of his young master. "Spire?" "Yes, sir," he answered, standing still with a pile of shirts on his arm. "Is this inn very full?" "Yes, very," said Spire. "The whole town is full of travellers and people from the country. A lot of our nobility and gentry are passing this way." He deposited the shirts on a shelf in the depths of the wall and turned round again. "Have you heard any names, Spire?" Spire stooped over a trunk and lifted up from it carefully a lot of white neckcloths, folded neatly one within the other. "I haven't had much time yet, sir. I heard a few." He laid down the neckcloths by the side of the shirts, while Cosmo, with his elbow on the mantelpiece, asked down the whole length of the room, "Anybody I know?" "Not in this place, sir. There is generally a party of officers from the man-of-war staying here. They come and go. I have seen some Italian gentlemen in square-cut coats and powdered hair. Very old-fashioned, sir. There are some Austrians, too, I think, but I haven't seen any ladies. I'm afraid, sir, this isn't the right sort of inn. There is another about 100 yards from here, on the other side of the square." "I don't want to meet anybody I know," said Cosmo Latham in a low voice. Spire thought that this would make his stay in Genoa very dull. At the same time, he was convinced that his young master would alter his mind before very long, and change to that other inn patronized by travelers of fashion. For himself, he was not averse from a little quiet time. Spire was no longer young. 30 years ago, before the war and the Revolution, he had traveled with Sir Charles in France and Italy. He was then only 18, but being a steady and trustworthy lad, was taken abroad to look after the horses. Sir Charles kept 4 horses in Florence, and Spire had often ridden on Tuscan roads behind Sir Charles and the 2 Misses Aston, of whom one later became Lady Latham. After the family settled in Yorkshire, he passed from the stables to the house, acquired a confidential position, and whenever Lady Latham took a journey, he sat in the rumble with a pair of double-barreled pistols in the pockets of his greatcoat, and ordered all things on the road. Later he became intermediary between Sir Charles in the stables, the gardens, and in all out-of-door things about the house. He attended Lady Latham on her very last drive, all the details for that lady's funeral having been left to his management. He was also a very good valet. He had been called one evening into the library where Sir Charles, very gouty that day, leaning with one hand on a thick stick and with the other on the edge of a table, had said to him, "I am lending you to Mr. Cosmo for his travels in France and Italy. You will know your way about. And mind you draw the charges of the pistols in the carriage every morning, and load them afresh." Spire was then requested to help Sir Charles up the stairs, and had a few more words said to him when Sir Charles stopped at the door of his bedroom. "Mr. Cosmo has plenty of sense. You are not to make yourself a nuisance to him." "No, Sir Charles," said the imperturbable Spire. "I will know how to look after Mr. Cosmo." And if he had been asked, Spire would have been able to say that during the stay in Paris, and all through France and Switzerland on the way to Genoa, Mr. Cosmo had given him no trouble at all. Spire, still busy unpacking, glanced at his young master. He certainly looked very quiet now, leaning on his elbow, with the firelight playing from below on his young, thoughtful face, with its smooth and pale complexion. Very good-looking indeed, thought Spire. In that thoughtful mood he recalled very much the Sir Charles of 30 or 35 years ago. Would he, too, find his wife abroad? There had been women enough in Paris of every kind and degree, English and French and all sorts. But it was a fact that Mr. Cosmo sought most of his company amongst men, of whom also there had been no lack, and of every degree. In that, too, the young man resembled very much his father, men's company. But were he to get caught, he would get caught properly. At any rate for a time, reflected Spire, remembering Sir Charles Latham's rush back to Italy, the inwardness of which had been no more revealed to him than to the rest of the world. Spire, approaching the candelabra, unfolded partly a very fine coat, then refolded it before putting it away on a convenient shelf. He had a moment of regret for his own young days. He had never married, not because there had been any lack of women to set their caps at him, but from a sort of half-conscious prudence. Moreover, he had a notion somehow or other that Sir Charles would not have liked it. Perhaps it was just as well. Now he was carefree, attending on Mr. Cosmo without troubling his head about who had remained at home. Spire, arranging the contents of a dressing-case on the table, cast another sidelong look at the figure by the fire. Very handsome. Something like Sir Charles, and yet not like. There was a touch of something unusual, perhaps foreign, and yet no one with a pair of eyes in his head could mistake Mr. Cosmo for anything but an English gentleman. Spire's memories of his tour with Sir Charles had been growing dim, but he remembered enough of the old-time atmosphere to have become aware of a feeling of tension, of a suggestion of restlessness which certainly was new to him. The silence had lasted very long. Cosmo, before the fire, had not moved. Spire ventured on a remark. "I notice people are excited about one thing and another hereabouts, sir." "Excited? I don't wonder at it. In what way?" "Sort of discontented, sir." "They don't like the Austrians, sir. You may have noticed as we came along. Did they like us when we held the town?" "I can hardly say that, sir. I have been sitting for an hour or more in the courier's room with all sorts of people coming in and out, and heard very wild sort of talk." "What can you know about its wildness?" "To look at their faces was enough. It's a funny place, that room downstairs," went on Spire, rubbing with a piece of silk a travelling looking-glass mounted cunningly in a silver case, which, when opened, made a stand for it. He placed it exactly in the middle of a little table and turned round to look at his master. Seeing that Cosmo seemed disposed to listen, he continued. "It is vaulted like a cellar, and has a little door giving into a side street. People come in and out as they like. All sorts of low people, sir. Facchini and carters and boatmen and such like. There was an old fellow came in, a grey-headed man, a cobbler, I suppose, as he brought a bag full of mended shoes for the servants of the house. He emptied the lot on the stone floor, sir, and instead of trying to collect his money from the people that were scrambling for them, he made them a speech. He spouted, sir, without drawing a breath. The courier valet of an English doctor staying here, a Swiss I think he is, says to me in his broken English, he would cut every Austrian throat in this town. We were having a glass of wine together, and I asked him, and what do you think of that? And he says to me, after thinking a bit, I agree with him. Very dreadful, sir, concluded Spire with a perfectly unmoved face. Cosmo looked at him in silence for a long time. It was very bold talk, if that is what the man really said, he remarked, especially as the place is so public, as you say it is. Absolutely open to the street, sir. And that same Swiss fellow had just told me before that the town was full of spies, and what they call sbirri, that came from Turin with the king.